Good evening, and tonight's topic is going to be the Sherman Tea Tray. You may not have heard of a tea tray. I know that doesn't sound very exciting, but put simply, it's a device that goes underneath the tank to protect it from landmines. Landmines in World War II were, and indeed to this day, still a huge problem. So for the Allies, the use of landmines by German forces in North Africa and Italy had proven to be a continual problem. And with Allied forces landing in northern France, this headache just continued and continued and continued, especially as forces advanced into Germany. By way of data on the topic, some good analysis by 21st Army Group showed that between the end of March and start of May 1945, so we're towards the end of the war here, they encountered mines no less than 77 times across a variety of devices, with the main ones being the Rigel R43 and the Teller anti-tank mines. The Teller was a disc-shaped mine, but the Rigel was a bar mine, that is, like a giant bar of chocolate, a dangerous one though, and one which could cause enormous loss and problems for a force trying to sort of move through an area, because if you encounter one mine, there's probably more, and now you've got to clear them. Not to mention the loss of the vehicle and the crews. So if mines are deployed correctly, they were a big problem. For 21st Army Group, their primary vehicle was the Sherman. Certainly Sherman, Cromwell, Challenger, Comet and Stuart all encountered mines with this unit during this period. The Sherman was by far and away the most numerous finder of these mines, with 42 of those 77 encounters. Behind it was the Cromwell at 19. What was really needed was a means to protect a vehicle from mines, but the nature of a mine strike was a very complex business, depending on exactly where the mine was encountered. It could be supposed, perhaps a little naively, that it's always the leading edge of the track, that front part of the track as it's going down over the ground, where it meets the mine. That is not the case, however. Indeed, data from 21st Army Group in this period showed that 45% of strikes, that is the most numerous place, but still less than half of the total, were at that location. Secondly, does the mine strike on the, if this is your track, does it strike on the outside edge or on the inside edge or directly underneath? Where is the blast being centered? This is a particular concern with a bar mine, where you might be encountering the edge and have the majority of the bar under the vehicle or exterior to the vehicle. So it's quite a complex determination. Put simply, if the closer the blast is to the center line of the vehicle, the more dangerous it is, because that's more blast being trapped under the vehicle. If it's just on the outside, often it would just be relatively minor damage to the suspension. Now, there had been attempts to reinforce the floor from blasts. As early as June 1944, the Department of Tank Design had tried a couple of options on the Lynx Mark 1 Scout car. Option 1 was a 6mm thick internally armoured floor. So as well as its normal floor plate, there'd be a secondary armoured floor plate fitted. The second option was an armoured plate slung underneath the actual vehicle, so a device that connects to it. And during testing, both actually worked. So the internal armour option worked. In terms, it protected the vehicle, it protected the crew, but the outer hull floor was breached. The externally slung armour plate also worked, but the real difference was that the internal plate was not damaged. So with the external option, the vehicle may still be potentially usable. With the internal armouring option, the vehicle was not usable, although you would at least manage to save your crews, which in many regards are more valuable than the vehicle itself. This external option, because of the shape of it being a tray of steel that fits under the vehicle, was quite Britishly called the tea tray, and the principle of an underslung armoured plate was thereby proven. By February 1945, the plan had developed into a full-length hull plate being slung underneath a tank made from separate sections and attached at the front and back to the towing hooks. So effectively it just sits underneath, almost like a hammock underneath the vehicle. Live mine trials using captured German Tellermines were done in February 1945 using the hull from a Sherman V, the Crab. This vehicle had been previously used for duplex drive trials. Like all good trials vehicles, the experimental vehicle, this Sherman Crab, was measured against an unprotected vehicle as the control. This vehicle was another Sherman, and that one had also outlived its usefulness. Photos of it show it with some interesting, unusual extra armour fitted for a trial I haven't yet determined. The results of these trials were quite dramatic. The unprotected vehicle, perhaps unsurprisingly, with the mine directly underneath the hull, was left utterly wrecked. There was a gigantic hole in the hull floor. The entire centre part of the vehicle had been blown in. The entire crew would have been left dead. The vehicle was wrecked beyond repair. For the Sherman V Crab, with the tea tray, the outcome could really not be much more different. The tea tray, whilst it had broken, some of the bolts had sheared off and the tea tray was broken, it had come off the vehicle was still intact. The floor had been slightly buckled, there was minor damage to the interior, but there was no penetration of the hull, and it's fair to assume that the crew would have survived the blast. Now, just to allay any doubts about blast injury, very unfortunately for the rabbits that were used, rabbits acted as surrogates for a human crew. So there were rabbits placed inside dummies inside both the control vehicle and the experimental vehicle. These would simulate the blast effect. For the protected vehicle, one rabbit died. Now this was the rabbit in a cage which was on the floor in the driver's area, and as the hull has moved up slightly, that shockwave has killed that rabbit. If this was a full-size human, substantially more mass involved and sat on a padded seat, it's reasonable to assume that they would have survived, albeit with minor injuries. All the other rabbits were fine. We don't count the fact that in the test one of the wires holding cage snapped and the rabbit fell and broke its leg. That's by the by. The rabbit survived. Tea tray was proven in that regard. The rabbits in the unprotected vehicle, they were utterly shredded. They were definitely dead. So despite what might be seen as a success for the device, it was considered generally inadequate. And that's because it caused problems. For a start, it was heavy, it was burdensome to move around, and worst of all, it substantially reduced the ground clearance of the vehicle. Additional trials were conducted in June 1945, and these ones used a Sherman 2. In fact, the very same Sherman 2 which had been used previously for trials on British Zimmerit, which you can read about in this magnificent book here. Don't worry about this line, this just because it's a proof printer copy. British Zimmerit by yours truly details the interminable lengths to develop a British form of Zimmerit. Well, the Sherman that was used in that Zimmerit trial went on to serve its country one more time by being the test vehicle for mine trials. Here they didn't fit the vehicle with tea tray. What they did was they looked at the evidence for where the most frequent mine strikes were, which was, fair enough, on that front leading edge. They put the mine directly onto the track, and they wanted to see what the actual damage would be under the vehicle. The reality was, it was relatively minor. The transmission housing was very robust and survived. The track was broken and damaged. The front suspension unit nearest to the mine was broken and the wheel was crushed. Other than that, the tank was okay. In other words, there was no need for the tea tray when you're playing the odds on the most common strikes. If 45% of your strikes didn't require it, and there are only 77 or so anyway in this operational month for a rather large army group, then effectively, tea tray was solving a problem that was not a big enough problem to warrant the solution that would have been needed. After all, it wouldn't have been very much use if only one or two vehicles had it. All the vehicles would have to be fitted. So tea tray was not a successful test, wasn't a successful plan. It was a successful experiment, but again, it, like so many of these other experiments, disappeared. You can read about the Sherman Tea Tray in this fine book here called An Unnecessary Burden, Sherman Tank versus Tellermine. It is not a big book, but it does detail all of the trials and tests and details what the tea tray exactly looked like. So if you were interested in maybe making some plastic model kits, something a little more unusual, sticking one of those under your Sherman, that is a perfectly viable thing to do. So that's it for now. It's only a short video on the tea tray. I'll be back later with another video. Thank you very much for your time. I will put a link to both the Zimmerit and the tea tray book in the chat below. If you do like this video, please do like, share, subscribe. If you wish to support any more of my research, my books, all that work, and some live work that I'll be doing later, which I'll tell you about, then please consider donating on Patreon. If nothing else, please follow me on Facebook. And that's it for now. Thank you very much for your time. Good night.